What if I told you that your desire isn't always about pleasure, but about pain? That what you call attraction might actually be an escape route, an anxious reflex, a secret deal between your body and your wounds. In this video, we are going to dive into one of the most disturbing truths Carl Jung ever hinted at, the link between sex and psychological suffering. And by the end, you'll understand why so many people use sex not to connect, but to disappear, to numb, to hide from themselves. You're about to discover something few dare to admit, even to themselves. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. There are moments when the silence inside someone becomes unbearable. Not because there is peace, but because that silence screams. And often, instead of facing that scream, people look for a way to muffle it. For some, it's work. For others, it's alcohol. But for many, too many, it's sex. Not as celebration, not as intimacy, but as sedative. You see, anxiety doesn't always wear the face of panic. Sometimes it dresses up as desire. Carl Jung knew that what the ego desires is often in direct conflict with what the soul truly needs. And nowhere is that more visible than in the moment someone craves sex not out of connection, but out of desperation. Have you ever felt it? That pull toward someone you barely know, that irrational urge in a moment of chaos, that need to feel someone else's skin, just so you don't have to be inside your own. That's not lust. That's not love. That's your trauma, wearing perfume. And Jung would call this the shadow in action, when the parts of ourselves we deny, repress, or ignore come to the surface, not gently, but violently, and seductively. Here's what no one tells you. Anxiety doesn't always feel like fear. Sometimes it feels like hunger, like obsession, like urgency, because the anxious mind is looking for an exit. And the body, confused by the language of the soul, translates that need for safety into a need for touch, for domination, for submission, for release. This is why someone can find themselves in bed with a stranger, heart pounding, not from excitement, but from fear. Not because they're chasing pleasure, but because they're running from pain. Jung believed that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. And in this case, sex becomes the substitute, the stand-in, the disguise. It looks like desire, but it's actually a scream that's lost its voice. Let me show you how deep this goes. Think of the man who feels utterly worthless unless he's desired, or the woman who only feels safe when she's being pursued. They may think they're confident, empowered, sexually free, but in truth, they're trapped, enslaved by an unconscious need to be seen, not out of joy but out of fear. What they seek in the other is not love. It's validation, a temporary high, an anesthetic. And here's the dark twist. It works. For a moment, they feel calm, not because the anxiety is gone, but because it's been pushed beneath sensation, swallowed by adrenaline, distracted by skin, but it never truly disappears, because the real wound remains untouched. Carl Jung would say that we are not possessed by sexual instinct, we are possessed by our unlived pain, and we project that pain into our behaviors, our cravings, our rituals. So when sex becomes a ritual of escape, it stops being human and starts being mechanical, repetitive, numbing. You don't make love to the person. You make love to the fantasy of being okay. You use the body as a gateway, not to intimacy, but to silence, to a break from the war inside your chest. And yet the silence never lasts. It fades and the noise returns louder, because the soul knows when it's been bypassed. You cannot trick it. You cannot sedate it forever. And this is where most people break, when they realize the very thing they thought was healing them was only delaying the collapse. We are taught to see sex as liberation, as freedom, as the ultimate proof of vitality. But what if it's just another cage, painted gold? There is a lie that echoes in the hearts of those who use sex as refuge. If I can just feel desired, I'll be safe. If I can just be wanted, I'll matter. If I can give enough of myself, I'll finally be loved. But Jung would ask, who exactly are you trying to convince? Because deep down there is a fracture, an early trauma, a moment, perhaps forgotten, when love became conditional and presence became transactional. It is no coincidence that many who suffer from anxiety or depression were never truly mirrored in childhood. They were never taught that simply existing was enough. So they learned to perform, to adapt, to seduce, not out of joy, but survival. And here's where it gets darker. The body remembers. Even when the conscious mind forgets, the body carries the imprint of being abandoned, of being shamed, of being invisible. And what is sex, if not a place where the body speaks louder than words? So it makes sense that someone with invisible wounds would turn to sex, not to celebrate who they are, but to escape who they think they are. Let me tell you a story. A man once confessed that he only felt alive during sex, not because of the pleasure, but because it was the only time he wasn't drowning in his own thoughts. He described it like a blackout, a pause, a death of the self. I don't want intimacy, he said. I want amnesia. That is the silent epidemic Jung warned us about. Not just repression, but disembodiment. Not just craving sex, but using it to erase the self. Jung believed the libido wasn't merely sexual energy, it was psychic energy. A vital force, yes, but one that can be twisted by trauma into compulsive patterns. When channeled unconsciously, libido becomes addiction. It becomes a loop, and if left unchecked, the loop becomes identity. This is how someone can confuse anxiety for desire. This is how someone can chase toxic partners and call it chemistry. This is how someone can sleep with 10 people and still feel utterly alone, because the problem was never outside. It was within. Sex becomes the symptom, but the illness is spiritual disconnection, and Jung would ask, what is the psyche trying to say beneath the act? That question shatters illusions, because when you strip away the fantasy, you're left with the reality that most people don't want sex. They want to be held, to be known, to be seen in the rawest, most unfiltered way, without being abandoned. But when that feels too risky, too impossible, they settle for the next best thing: temporary merging, brief oblivion, fleeting validation. And so, they return to the cycle. The one-night stands, the secret affairs, the compulsive swipes, looking for someone who can drown out the noise. But here's the paradox. The more you seek refuge in others, the more you abandon yourself. This is what Jung called the tragedy of projection, when we cast our unmet needs onto others, hoping they will fix what we refuse to face. But no one can hold the weight of your unloved inner child. No partner can carry your suppressed anxiety. No orgasm can cure your existential dread. Because what's broken is not your sex life. It's your connection to your soul. And until that is addressed, every sexual encounter will feel both euphoric and hollow, intoxicating and depressing. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, a cry from the unconscious that says, I need to feel something, anything, that proves I still exist. But Jung would say, to feel real, you must first face the unreal parts of yourself, not bury them under skin, not silence them with sensation, but bring them into the light. What happens when sex becomes your sanctuary? But the sanctuary starts to poison you. At first, it feels like a lifeline, a shot of adrenaline, a high that numbs the ache just enough to survive another day. But over time, you begin to notice something is wrong. You're not connecting, you're escaping, you're not present, you're performing, and after each encounter, instead of feeling whole, you feel emptier, more fragmented, more alone than you were before. It starts to haunt you in the silence between lovers, in the way your hands tremble when there's no one left to touch, in the way your soul recoils when someone gets too close. Jung would call this the shadow in motion. It's not just what we repress, it's what we repeat, over and over, until the pattern finally screams louder than the pleasure. You begin to realize you're not chasing love. You're running from pain. This is the shock most aren't ready for. The moment you see your reflection, not in a mirror, but in your own patterns. And it hits you. I wasn't trying to be loved. I was trying to disappear. Sex wasn't intimacy. It was anesthesia. And that's the terrifying truth. Because no one talks about the kind of loneliness that exists even in a warm bed. The kind that makes you feel like a ghost in your own life. Seen, touched, but never truly met. It's here where the real descent begins, when you realize you've built an identity around being desired, but have no idea who you are when no one is looking. You start asking the questions Jung warned us about. What masks have I been wearing? What part of me is crying for help beneath the performance? And most importantly, who am I, without the validation? For some, this crisis leads to collapse. Depression deepens. Anxiety sharpens. Because the unconscious refuses to be ignored forever. It doesn't whisper. It roars. In panic attacks, in compulsive urges, in that hollow chest pain that no doctor can explain. But here is where transformation begins. Not in the escape, but in the confrontation. Jung believed that the path to wholeness was through the wound, that the very thing we avoid holds the key. So, what happens when you stop using sex as a hiding place? You begin to hear yourself, truly, without distraction, without noise, without seduction, and that's when the real terror sets in. Because now you face what you've buried, the grief, the shame, the loneliness you pretended didn't exist. But here's the paradox. That's also where you find your soul, not in another person's eyes, but in the mirror of your own suffering. That's where the self begins to emerge. The deeper self, not the persona, not the performer, not the wounded child begging to be loved, but the one who watches it all. The one who remembers. The one who was never broken, only buried. Jung called this the process of individuation, the painful, sacred journey of becoming who you truly are. And sometimes it begins in the most unlikely place, in the wreckage of your own patterns, in the silence after yet another empty encounter, in the moment you finally say, "This isn't working anymore." That moment, that's not failure, that's awakening, and it changes everything, because now the question shifts. Not, how can I be wanted, but, what do I actually need? Not, how do I avoid anxiety? But, what is it trying to teach me? Not, how can I stop feeling so alone? But, where have I abandoned myself? This is where the healing begins. And yes, it's terrifying. But it's real. And in a world addicted to illusion, reality is the rarest drug of all. There's a moment, after all the distractions fade, when you finally sit alone with your pain. No mask, no performance, just you, and the echo of everything you tried not to feel. This is where most people run, but this is where Jung invites you to stay. Because beneath the layers of fear, shame, and anxiety, there is something ancient waiting to be known. Not the self you've shown the world, but the self that has been watching from the dark. Jung believed that the soul does not thrive in perfection. It thrives in wholeness. And to be whole, we must embrace the parts we've exiled. So if sex became your escape, you must ask, what were you running from? Perhaps it was the fear of being seen, not just physically, but emotionally. Perhaps it was the terror of intimacy, because real closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability means the possibility of rejection, of abandonment, of pain. And for someone who carries unresolved trauma, especially from childhood, that risk feels unbearable. So you chose control. You chose roles. You chose the fantasy, because reality was too raw. But fantasy cannot hold you. It can stimulate, it can distract, but it cannot heal. Jung teaches us that healing requires integration, not suppression, not avoidance, but the courage to bring the unconscious into consciousness. You must see the scared child behind the seducer, the abandoned one behind the addict, the anxious soul behind the confidence, and only then can you begin to love what you once ran from. Only then can you use your suffering as a compass, not a curse. You may ask, how does this help my anxiety? How does this cure the dread that clings to me in silence? And the answer is difficult, but true. Your anxiety was never the enemy. It was the messenger. It was the scream of the soul trying to be heard, begging you to stop performing, to stop escaping, to come home. When you no longer use sex as a shield, you begin to feel again. And yes, at first it's overwhelming, because you've been numb for so long. But gradually, you learn to sit with discomfort, to face your triggers with compassion, not panic, to choose presence over pleasure, depth over distraction, and in doing so, you reclaim your life, not as an object of desire, but as a subject of meaning. This is what Jung meant by holding the tension of the opposites. You are both light and shadow, longing and fear, power and pain, and when you stop choosing one over the other, you stop splitting, you stop fragmenting, you become whole. So if you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in these words, in the hunger, in the patterns, in the quiet despair, know this: you are not broken. You are awakening. This pain you're feeling is not a punishment. It's a portal, and if you be brave enough to walk through it, you will meet the parts of yourself you never knew existed, the parts that don't need to be wanted, the parts that don't need to perform, the parts that are already enough. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Sex was never the answer. It was just the symptom. The real answer is integration, wholeness, the return to yourself. Jung would say that modern culture teaches us to worship the persona, the image, the status, the approval, but the soul. The soul lives in the places we're afraid to go, and if you want to heal from anxiety, from depression, from the silent trauma of abandonment, you cannot seduce your way out. You cannot numb your way through. You must descend into your fears, into your longing, into the truth of who you are beneath the layers. That descent, it's sacred, because only in the dark do we finally see what's real. So, if any part of this spoke to something deep inside you, if you felt exposed or understood or seen, comment below, "I'm coming home." Let the world know you're done running, that you're choosing to feel, to face, to heal, because the only way out is in. And that journey, Carl Jung would say, it's the most human thing you can do.